This is part two of Conversations and Consciousness. And I'm so honored to have Grant Cameron here at my home so that we can gab together and we can share with you what our thoughts are. Both of us, as you know, are nuts and bolts researchers. I started in 1980 with Dr. Alan Hynek doing all kinds of research. I have, just tons and tons of files. I've done work all over the world, and it was all nuts and bolts. It was gathering the data. And Grant the same. Grant worked on documents, and he was very interested in finding out who knew about this phenomena after his experience with Charlie Red Star. So the thing is that we both started like that, and then what happened in the progress of our study, and I think that Grant and I really study this phenomenon because we want to know what's going on. We began to look at the whole entire situation. It wasn't just the sightings. Grant began to speak to the witnesses. I began to look at the paranormal aspect. I've always been interested in that anyway. And I realized that the phenomenon is physical, spiritual, paranormal, and I hate using that word because the paranormal is really normal. And it is far more complex than just aliens visiting us from other worlds. But that's the interesting part, because Grant will even add, and in part one, that it has to do with life after death. That has to do with death. It has to do about who we are. It has to do about the lack of separation, that this is all one. A consciousness that manifests itself in nuts and bolts phenomena. And Grant, you just started talking about in part one about apports, about music. I want you to discuss the three books, the contact modality book, the tuned in book, and the inspired book that give you new information about this phenomenon.
Yeah, it's almost like once you get into the consciousness field and you shift it, you start to attract different stories. So I had the download experience, and I came across a prime experiencer whose name is Chris Bledsoe, who's a very religious guy in North Carolina whose life was sort of thrown upside down by his encounter. And I had an experience with him in 2013, which I won't get into, but it ensured me that this guy was talking, something was going on. This is not an ordinary guy. And he gave me a phone call in 2015, and you see the synchronicities, and almost like you're being led, which I now sort of realize that if something interests me, I go there because I know it's giving me an indication to go. So what happened was he phoned me up, and this is two times I got a message from supposedly an alien. And he phoned me up and he said he deals with what he calls the Guardians. And he phoned me up, or he emailed me and he said, I have a message for you from the Guardians. And because I realized he was this real guy, I said, really? You got a message for me? And he said, yeah, they want you to know the messages in the music. And I went, well, Chris, you're probably talking to the wrong guy, because I don't listen to music, I don't play music, I'm not interested in music, I've never had anything to do with music. And he just kept talking, and he said, well, one of the songs I think you should listen to is Kashmir by Led Zeppelin. And I went, okay, whatever. And I wasn't listening to him. And then he said, and this is how they drag you in. You see these synchronicities.
Well, tell everybody what happened to you.
Yeah, so he said, oh, and the other song you should listen to is After the Gold Rush by Neil Young. And I went, Neil Young is involved in this? And he said, yeah. I said, Neil Young grew up in my city. Like, I live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, which I always make the joke. Not even people in Canada want to visit Winnipeg. It's like the coldest major city in the world. It is not like a super, tourist attraction. And yet Neil Young grew up there. And so I said, Neil Young was involved? And he went, yeah. And I went, oh, I'm going to check into this. And the song was After the Gold Rush, and that's where he talks about what a lot of experiencers talk about is this warning. They see the screen and they're told the environmental devastation, how we're destroying the world and all this sort of stuff. And the lyrics in the song say, he talked, Mother Nature's on the run, and he's in a bombed out basement, and the silver seeds, the flying saucers, come down and they take the chosen ones off to another planet. And so when I saw that, I went, whoa, and I started to check this. And that's when I realized this whole noetic quality that had to do with music was this bizarre situation where many, many piles of the top musicians of all times had this fascination with UFOs. They would claim abduction experiences, encounter experiences. It was just unbelievable. And so I started to gather all this material together. And the other thing I realized was I had the download experience, And as I'm working on this, I suddenly did a download, put download and musician, and I started to realize in the end, I had about 150 songs that had come in dreams.
And you have my favorite, which is a Moody Blues.
Yeah.
I was always attracted to the Moody Blues songs because I always figured they had a plug-in to something special.
And that's what they claim. They actually talked to Colin Andrews, our friend Colin Andrews, and they told Colin Andrews that they'd all had the encounter with the beings, and that they remember before they were born. And Colin said they wanted to meet after a session of his, and Pinder was there, and the lead guitarist was there, and Colin said they were going back and forth, back and forth. He said you could tell they were making up a story. This guy, and they're talking, and they said before they were born, they knew they were going to be musicians. They knew they were going to put lyrics into songs, and then the lead guitarist said, Tell him how we came back in. Tell him how we came back in the earth. And these are guys that sold 50 million albums.
I know.
And I have a guy in Canada who's going to come up with a book shortly about his encounter, and he remembers before he was born as well, that he was with the beings, and they said, we need you to go down there, and he said, no, I'm not going down there. I've heard about that place, I'm not going. And they said, well, no, you got to go, and they had this discussion, and he remembered. And the same with Chris Bledsoe. When Chris Bledsoe had the regression, and his life had been devastated, because it sort of affected his worldview. When he had the regression, John Mack's associate, Dr. Michael O'Connor, was doing the regression, and he said to Chris, he said, so when did you first meet these beings? And he said, they've been with me since before I was born. And so this is where they come this multiple life thing, where even John Mack talks about the one guy where he talks to him, he says, okay, when did you see these people? 9. When did you see it before that? Oh, 2 years old. Any time before that? Oh yeah, he was with me in my last lifetime. And you realize it's this complex situation. So I gathered all this stuff together, and I put it all in this unbelievable book. And I know my father...
They're called Tuned In.
Tuned In. And you talk about synchronicities. I'll give you a synchronicity. And I said I would introduce you to Jo Wood. And she was married to Ronnie Wood from the Rolling Stones. Yeah. And she now does a podcast called Alien Nation. And she had her own experience, and her son had an experience, her and her son on the Stones plane, where this UFO comes down the side of the plane and sort of looks in the window at the sun, and the son's looking at this thing, and what's that, Mom? And so you have this whole thing where I have the synchronicity with her, where I get told, Jo Wood is running this podcast in Great Britain, and gave me an interview of one of my friends, and so I said, she's doing alien podcast? And I go, oh, I got to see it. I wonder if she interviewed any of the aliens or any of the musicians. And I go, and sure enough, the first one she did was Sean Ryder, famous British musician, who, when he was, I think, delivering papers as a kid, saw 100 UFOs at one time. So she's interviewing him, and here's the synchronicity. So he's going along, and she says, Sean, tell me, why did they pick you? And he says, I think I was tuned in. And I went, that's in my book, and he's in my book. And I go, that's really weird. So it was Pia Knudsen who told me that from Denmark. So I write Pia Knudsen, and I write her, and I say to her, you're not going to believe what happened. I went to her podcast. The first one I listened to is Sean Ryder, and Sean Ryder said he was tuned in, and that's the name of my book, and he's in my book. And then she's reading the email, and she was doing a Zoom broadcast, and Melinda Leslie was doing a broadcast to them, and as she said, as she's reading the email, Melinda Leslie shows a picture of a Ryder truck on the
as
street.
part of a PowerPoint, yeah.
Exactly the same
so
time.
that's such a great example of how the universe validates, or whatever it is that's talking to us validates what path we're on. Even as researchers, these what we call paranormal, or these synchronicities. It's the language of consciousness. It's the language
That's how
of
they work.
That's how it works.
They're working through images. They're not working through words. They're working through images.
It's not words.
I'll give you the other one. It's another friend, your friend of mine, and Uri Geller, and Sid Goldberg. So
it's beautiful.
He was involved in the John Lennon sighting.
Yeah.
And he claimed that John Lennon had given this little egg.
This
and he said,
golden egg.
this may be my ticket to another planet, but I don't want it, you can have it. And he gives it to Uri Geller. And Uri Geller said he's kept it on his person his whole life since 1979 or whenever he was given it. And so Sid Goldberg, our friend from Gaia, is doing an interview in Israel with Uri Geller.
In a cafe.
Well, he does he's talking to him before he goes to the cafe. But he says, what do you want to ask Uri? And I said, I want you to ask him about the egg. let him see the egg and tell it. So he tells the story about John Lennon and the egg and stuff like that. So Sid sends me a photograph, and he's holding the egg like this, and sort of like showing me. I've asked him about the egg and stuff. So I said, "Good boy, Sid. Maybe your ticket to another planet." So as I send the email, this is a little bit later. I send the email. He's in the cafeteria with Uri Geller, and he's talking about me, and then he says, "Oh, look, there's an email coming from him right now." And he opens the email, and it says, "Good boy, Sid, maybe your ticket to another planet." And he reads this to Uri Geller, and Uri Geller points up at the ceiling, and they're playing Imagine on the radio.
Imagine by John Lennon.
John Lennon.
And this happened with me. I have so many stories with Uri, apart from the fact that talking about him to Angela Thompson Smith, I come back and my car keys are so bad I cannot shove them into the car. I have to push and push. Really bend my keys back because it wouldn't go in the car. Just talking about Uri to Angela Thompson Smith. But then when I went to give the donation to Children's Hospital, because Uri is in my conference on ESP, and he asked for the donation in his name to Children's Hospital, just as I'm pressing my credit card number on my big TV set here is the advertisement for Denver's Children's Hospital with all the kids, just as I'm about to give the donation. I think people like Uri, I think people that have these talents or powers or whatever, are solidly plugged into the field.
Yeah.
And certain musicians are solidly plugged into the field. I was wondering if you could talk very, very quickly about what the field does as the manifestation of consciousness. For instance, the apports, the things that fall out of the sky, the people, and in the old days they used to call it poltergeist activity, but you've kind of changed that.
Yeah, and it happened at your conference. It all started at your conference. I was talking, and it actually starts with Ray Hernandez. We're at LAX airport. The Uber doesn't come. They have phoned 3 Ubers that can't get it, so we're sitting there talking, and I said to him, because I believe firmly, you got to talk to people who are interacting with the phenomena. And he has this big catalog of people, and I said, "Who's the best one you've got?" He said, "Alberto." And he starts talking about Alberto, and then he says, "Oh, and he's got all these apports, these swords and stuff are falling out of the ceiling." And I go, "They're what?" And I was like, "What are you talking about there?" And so he explains this thing to me, and I go, "That's really weird." So I'm coming to your conference last year. So before I get to the conference, I come in a day before, and I'm playing on the computer, and I say, "I'm going to study this." So I go Apport, and up pops Stanley Krippner giving a lecture about apports from a psychic from Brazil. And that's the thing, it's all connected. So whether it's psychic phenomena, UFOs, life after death, remote viewing, it's all the same thing. So the psychics were getting these apports as well. So Stanley Krippner says, "Well, I had all these apports from this guy in Brazil, and someone broke in my house and stole them all." So then he said, so the next ones I got from the guy, I decided I had to protect them. So what I did is I sent them to a university in Canada, the University of Manitoba. And I went, I worked there for 37 years. And I go, like, what's the chances? And that was like the signal. It's like Chris Bledsoe, the thing with Neil Young. It was like, oh, I got to do this. And then you know the rest of the story, and it's a long story, we really can't tell.
Yeah,
but the feathers.
With the feathers, with Tony Bice actually came to my conference. He's never
looking
been.
for you and me, and it was about consciousness.
Yeah.
He was being able to film these things in his backyard. He knew there was a
there
consciousness.
were UFOs,
and his
very
wife
clear.
said, "Do not go, you're sick.
Yeah.
You've got young kids, you've never left the country. And how do you know Paula Harris and Grant Cameron are going to talk to you?" And he comes and he tells us a story about the feathers and him and his wife.
Right.
And the confirmation. He says, "I need a confirmation that I should talk to Grant and Paula and go to this conference." And the feather comes flying across the sky, and he goes, "Thank you." And the feather goes flying off. And you really don't believe it, but what happens at your conference is the feathers start again, and it happens. And the last day, you come down with this big feather shirt on.
With this huge feather shirt I bought in Italy. But what was interesting is his wife wouldn't let him go until she got a sign, because often with these people, it's the family or it's the wife or somebody that stops them from actually getting the answers they want. But his wife opened up a closet and a whole bunch of feathers came out. And when she did that,
I heard a little bit different. What he said to her is, she knew he was taking these photographs, and so then she said, he kept bugging her, and she said, "No, you shouldn't go." And then she said, "I think I'll try it." So she went. She said, "Okay, if this is a real deal, show me a feather." And she goes walking out to the train. She works in London, England.
That's
and
right.
and she said the feather fell in front of her, and she got, "That's kind of weird." And then so she went and she said, "Well, there's never feathers on the London Bridge, never." So she said, okay, I want a feather on the London Bridge. And she's coming off the London Bridge and down comes a feather. And then she's having her little affair now, not like Crazy Tony anymore, now it's her. So she says, okay, I want to see lots of feathers. Lots of feathers. Not one feather, I want to see lots of feathers. And she's going back on the train the same day, and the train door opens outside of London, and she opens it up, and there's a bush with hundreds of feathers in this bush. And now she goes to Tony and says, okay, you can go. And he goes, well, what changed? And she'll tell you when the kids go to bed. And then the next day, she starts playing the game. So she says, okay, I want to see another feather. And the door is open to the patio, and she's sitting there, and she's 5 feet from the door working at the desk. And then all of a sudden she looks, and there's this feather, and it comes through the door and lands right at her feet. And then we had the ones
You had the ones, and I didn't tell you I had one too. This summer when I was in Roswell, I was despondent about something. I was sitting on a park bench and a feather came out of the sky right to my foot. Yeah. And I said, here we go again. But Tony has been communicating constantly with us because a lot of these people that have these experiences can't explain them. And when you take the time to actually talk to people and say, look, it's normal, you're just...
Yeah, they come to us, they're trying to figure out what's going on. So that's why they wanted to talk to us. He knew there was consciousness was involved. He knew he was...
Also UFOs, though.
Oh, yeah, he had UFOs, and he had helicopters, he had all
He had
orbs.
UFO pictures, so people say, well, what in the world does a UFO have to do with feather? The feather is the manifestation, the signal. You can get it any which way. I mean, it doesn't have to be feathers. It could be any kind of coincidences. I've had 2 occasions where I was doing work, one in England and one in Crestone, where when I was sleeping, my name was called in the middle of the room. It was not in my head. When I was doing the Jason Andrews story, I had my name called, and when I was doing the story with Ricardo Gonzalez Rantarel, I had my name called in the bedroom aloud, and I never thought it was a ghost. I didn't know what it was. These are manifestations, if you allow them to happen, that say, okay, keep doing the work you're doing because you're along the right path. I really think that they also encourage us to go on this path of consciousness, don't you?
Yeah, and even if you go back even to the remote viewing days, they had it back then. Because you see now, everybody's getting confused because we're into the nuts and bolts. So now there's these pieces of metal. I'm just, look at these pieces of metal. We analyze it, we're going to build a flying saucer and stuff like that. And I say, do you think a flying saucer came across the galaxy and then pieces started falling off it? And I'm going, no, they're probably dropping this stuff. And what happened was I actually went to Hal Putoff, a friend of yours, and a friend of mine that we've dealt with for years. So I said to Hal, I said, you dealt with this in the early days of SRI, when Uri Geller was there. Uri Geller's there, they take Uri Geller out for lunch, and Uri Geller's eating the ice cream, and he bites down, and the tie clip cuts his lip, and he pulls it out, and Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14 astronaut, says, where did you get that from? I lost that in Houston years ago. And Yuri's never been to Houston, and he gets it, and they walk back to the laboratory, and Hal Putoff and Mitchell, Uri Geller's in another room, and they're there, and the back half of the tie pin falls behind them, and then they find another one, and I've heard Edgar Mitchell had a number of Apport things. So I went to Hal, and I said, you're working on this metamaterial stuff. Don't you think this is probably Apport material? You had this going on, and he was very, very cool about it. He said, we're going to analyze the material first, one step at a time. So he didn't deny that this might be Apport material, but that's where people get in this idea where I see it in a different perspective. They're seeing it as, we're going to back engineer it and stuff like that. And I see it as, no, they're just trying to wake you up.
It's a message to wake you up, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, the book that's in is called The Way of the Explorer. I read that book in Switzerland at Christmas time. And when I saw that ice cream tie clip thing, when I read that, I was like mind blown because Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14 astronaut, was mainly interested in the paranormal, in the SRI experiments, and in the fact that he had this experience, which was an epiphany, when he was on his way to the moon.
On the way back.
On the way back, yeah. And he said he looked at the universe.
And he got the oneness.
And he got the oneness thing, that he was not anymore a body, he was not anymore an ego, but he was one. And that transformed him. Here's an engineer. Here's a guy that is a scientist, engineer. He said, enough of that. He
could have made millions doing other stuff.
Yeah, he could have gone back. He could have done, he said, and then he instituted the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which I think with Dean Radin and those guys is a scientific way of proving ESP and entanglement. they're trying with physics and science to explain the paranormal.
Yeah.
It's like the dog wag the dog, you know, the tail. It's like they want to explain something that exists in a scientific way, and then they're going to have to go back to the paranormal way.
Yeah.
Because the scientific way, the way we do it on this planet, we could talk about atoms, we can talk about entanglement, may not really go there. What may go there is just what John Mack calls a knowing. A knowing,
Yeah.
the knowing that this is
See,
real.
then what's happening there is this verb noun thing. So it's a verb. It's a thing which it's moving, it's growing, it's learning and stuff like that. But because the scientific community is the high priest of the modern world, they want something that you can touch, feel, name. So you got to put names on it. So it's this, it's that, and they're trying to appease the scientific community by trying to use the left brain to figure out it works like this, it works like that,
Yeah.
and yet you have got to go back. It's a verb. You forget about all the nouns. It's this verb thing. But they have moved, and that's what's happened. Is
Yeah.
the more the scientific community moves into this aspect, and they're all in especially quantum physics is into the consciousness thing. The more it validates what we've been saying for years, and the more it goes along, the more people realize that
That's
we
the good
were right
part.
all along.
Yeah, we were right all along. But personally, it's going to take us a long time to go there, where there's a fast track there. If people just move into looking at the whole phenomenon as a consciousness manifestation. Grant, you know, if you had to talk to the general public, general public, what would you give them as advice to find out what they need to know? What kind of advice would you give them? We'll wrap up with this. You can.
Well, the four main people just to watch this series. So you're doing Jacques Vallée.
Yeah.
You're hoping to do Colin Andrews.
I hope you
and the people that are on the leading edge. And I think we are the people on the leading edge that have described this before. You're the Super Bowl of all stories if you understand what's going on.
Yeah.
That 1,000 years from now, they're going to say,
Stephen,
"Boy, I wish
Stephen Greer.
Stephen
Greer.
They'll say, "I wish I was one of those people. They knew when this things first started what was actually going on." So that's our thing. And so people can watch this series and development, and realize that there are people who have moved out of that nuts and bolts world who are talking about this, and there's more people all the time. I wasn't until 2012. I don't know when you got into consciousness, but I was 2012. I wasn't talking it, and you see now, even in the UFO community now, people are all talking about consciousness, but they're just using the word. But at least they realize you can't. We're no longer the crazy people in the
No, and it's not a new age word. I mean, we're not playing new age. It's almost pseudoscientific. It's not new age. It's figuring it out and being invited into this new sandbox, this new play area. And I really do encourage a lot of our research colleagues to start looking at this as an aspect of the UFO phenomenon.